It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar on conflict trends in Somalia. Can't you hear me? Okay. Try again. Do you hear me? No? Yep. There's a place there. Okay, we'll try again. Now you can hear me. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar on conflict trends in Somalia, the Central African Republic, and the wider Sahel. Our speakers today are Andrews Atta Asamoah, Amandine Gnanguenon, and Stephanie Wolters. Stephanie is division head, and Andrews and Amandine are senior researchers at the Conflict Prevention and Risk Analysis Division at the Institute for Security Studies. They are based in Pretoria and Dhaka. ISS is an institute that has been a partner of NUPI in the Training for Peace program for almost 20 years. So we have close ties to them. And it's an annual event that staff from ISS come to NUPI to share their insights with us and a wider Norwegian audience. Today we will hear presentations on the consequences of ungoverned spaces in Mali, CAR and Somalia, and on terrorism in the Sahel, a regional perspective. After which you will have the opportunity to ask questions and offer comments. So with no further ado, I'll give the floor to Stephanie first. Is it? Oh, Amandine. Yeah. We'll just move away. Bring this with me.
Okay, it's going to be fine. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I will give you a brief overview about the Sahel and also the Mali. The idea is to then open the debate about different issues and mainly regarding my concluding remarks on what are the main challenges now to resolve this conflict. Okay. First of all, at ISS, we are working on a very broad perspective of security, and it's called human security. So I wanted first to give you this very broad overview about what are the main human security issues in the Sahel. First of all, you have the environmental degradation in Sahel. As you know, it's a semi-arid region. You have drought, and which is actually recurrent in the region and which has a direct impact on pastoralism population and also the lifestyle of people in the Sahel. According to the Norwegian Refugees Council reports, the last one, we can say that displacement caused by disaster is growing and in scale, frequency and complexity. And we can also say that displacement is expected to increase rapidly in the Sahel, but also in Africa, where population is predicted to double between 2015 and 2050. The other consequences of this is, of course, you have refugees from the different conflicts in terms of security impact, but you are more and more climatic refugees in the Sahel. The second idea is, of course, the question about food insecurity. And as you know, food insecurity is due to very complex factors at the, economic, political, and also social factors. And to give you just an idea, we have now in the Sahel 13 million people food and nutrition insecure. The other issue is about health insecurity. As you know, we had not only in the Sahel, but in the Western Africa, the Ebola outbreak. And this is a very interesting issue because that actually is not only about Ebola, but it is also what the Ebola outbreak reveals about state capacity in terms of conflict management, not only in the military position, but also in terms of health insecurity, and also definitely the lack of prevention of this kind of crisis. The other, long-standing issues may be the economic impact of the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. And the link with the Sahel could be, if you have a look to the last report of the UN Secretary on Mali, we can say that there is he is concerned about the consequences on the soldier of the MINUSMA, because in the MINUSMA, as you know, we have 164 Guinean and also 45 people coming from Liberia and four people coming from Guinea. So you can imagine the consequences to have people affected by Ebola coming at the MINUSMA. Maybe it's also important to notice that the Ebola outbreak is in short term a very big issue, but you have more death from malaria than from Ebola in the long term. So it's also important to give this in mind. The other issues in terms of human security is, of course, the socioeconomic issue. As you know, disparities in wealth distribution and also in socioeconomic development persists in the in West Africa. And many of the conflicts are fueled actually by this limited access to basic services. And Mali, again, is a very good example. In terms of political aspects, maybe if you just have a look to the table, you will see that the major concern about Western Africa and also Sahel will be the next election, and particularly in Burkina Faso. As you know, the President Compaoré is playing a big role in the process of mediation. Has played a major role in terms of process mediation by the past, and Burkina is still a very strong partner. Is notably part of the G5. So we need to have a look regarding the decision the President Compaoré will decide to check, change or not the constitution, because we will see maybe a spillover effects, not mainly in Western Africa, but also in all Africa. Other issue in Niger and Chad, which actually will have election in 2 years. So this is in terms of basic, in very structural factors of conflict in the Sahel. But we also have, maybe there is nothing new in terms of security issue. If you just have a look of what the different challenges I showed you, there is nothing new. But the question is more how they can interact each other. In what way they can influence each other, creating what we called in Mali actually a conflict system. How these different conflicts, economic, social, environmental, health, food, how can they interact together? How some of them can be root causes, other can be triggers. So this is what is the challenge actually now in the Sahel. So you also have this factor of instability, of course. And the main factors, the first factor of instability is drug trafficking in the region. And there is mainly drug trafficking, but also more and more consumption and production of drugs in the Sahel. The other one is human trafficking, and Niger is a very good example. You see, human trafficking is not only about something at the local level, I mean, within population. The last case with the Hama Amadou, the president of the National Assembly, showed that in what way we can have a very high level implication in this human trafficking. You also have, of course, illegal immigration. And finally, we see how we broke the deadlock. So it's also a very good example. Other issue, arms trafficking, of course, which is definitely not new in Western Africa. And it's a very big challenge because we have this proliferation of small arms and light weapons in the Sahel. The last one would be the terrorism issue. And, the money laundering issue, which is actually the fertile grounds. I mean, drug, human, and arms trafficking are the fertile ground for money laundering. Finally, the last one would be the terrorist issue. We know that there is more than 30 terrorist attacks in January this year, to give you an idea. And of course, the last, I mean, the kill of the peacekeepers from Niger during the last few days is also a very good example of the instability in northern Mali. So Mali is still the most vulnerable country in the Sahel, and we can say that actually there is a multidimensional crisis that Mali has suffered, has to be placed in the framework of the crisis experienced by the Malian states. What is important to notice is actually we need to implement some reforms, but more and more there is, we can observe a slow restoration of services, notably in the northern Mali. And of course, and also a lack of confidence at the local level. And if you have a look to the map, it's very interesting. Maybe the map on the left, with the density of population, we can see that everybody is concerned about northern Mali. But if you compare north and southern, you can see that definitely the population, I mean the demographic pressure is more on the southern. And what is also interesting to notice, it's actually we were with ISS, we did this report about the consequences, I mean the assessment of humanitarian aid and also development in the free northern region. And what we can say that actually there is more and more this perception that development is a reward actually for rebellion. Because if you have a look, it's only when you take up arms that you can be here. So this is one of the main conclusions when you talk with people from the ground. Maybe quickly, to have a look to the challenging negotiation process. Actually, the subject of today's ungoverned space. But actually, if we take the example of Northern Mali, it's not an ungoverned space. Maybe the complexity of the situation is because there is too many actors who want to control the space, Northern Mali. And now the difficulty is maybe to create confidence and also to create the good condition to have the states, the Malian states coming back in Northern Mali. And just to give you an example, I mean, the challenging negotiation process is very interesting because if you have a look, we have now 4 armed groups. We had 4 armed groups at the beginning, a few years ago. And now we have 8 armed groups with 6 taking part in the Algiers process at the moment. And as you know how there is more and more this will from local groups to take part in this political process, you can see that in August, we had 2 more groups who decided to create and who wanted to be represented at the negotiation process. It is the GATIA and also the MPSA. So you can maybe see how complex is the situation at the moment and how, I mean, the difficulty is now to implement the security and development nexus because, of course, in theory, we need this. I mean, you cannot have security in Northern Mali I mean, you cannot have development in northern Mali without security. But at the same time, the main causes of insecurity now in northern Mali are due to the lack of development, the lack of welfare states in northern Mali. So this is the big issue. So one of the main challenges at the moment is to do development and security at the same times, because most of the time we see that development is supposed to be a long-term issue. But the challenge is to have development now. And if you just, again, have a look to northern Mali, when you discuss with people, they say, we don't want the states, I mean the Malian state, because when the state come back, it's only the army, it's only the repressive, authoritative parts of the states. And we don't want it. We want to have the welfare state. I mean, we want to have the promise kept, actually. So maybe to conclude, it's like a brainstorming, so there is a lot of idea, but the challenges for conflict resolution mechanism. The first one is, there is a lack of capacity of MINUSMA. I mean, the last attack is a very good example that the lack of logistics, there is not enough people on the ground. I mean, how can you control northern Mali with 9,000 people coming from different countries? And remember, the countries who actually are in northern Mali, I mean, some of the armies don't have the capacity to protect their own states, but they are supposed to work together to protect the Malian people. So it's very difficult. The other thing is about Barkhane. Barkhane is maybe one of the main interesting solutions in terms of regional approach of this question of terrorism in Mali, in northern Mali, and also in Sahel. But can you really say that the military means are the solution to prevent terrorism in the region? Definitely not. So what the other option we can have? I mean, Western countries have to intervene and to prevent and to manage crises like in Mali. Maybe the other remarks we can say, the proliferation Sahel strategy. At the moment, we have 10 Sahel strategies. Can you imagine? The real challenge is now, how can we coordinate, how can we harmonize this Sahel strategy? And that's why the UN decided to create a platform and with a technical secretariat to do this job. But it's again a real challenge, because as we can say, there is actually fights against different actors, because everybody wants to find the solution in Mali. So it's very difficult to cooperate together. Another idea, it's maybe the G5. G5 is a very interesting structure at the moment. G5, it's Mali, Mauritania, Faso, and Chad, which decided actually to put together within one organization. And if you have a look to the table, you can see that you have the three main actors in all the strategy at the Western African level. You have Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Of course, in G5, you need Chad, because the role of the country is playing at the moment in terms of military. Don't forget that you also have the French-based Operation Barkhane in Chad. Don't forget that we will have election next year in Chad. And the other state is, of course, Burkina Faso, because of the common borders with the other states. So the question is, maybe, as you see, I was talking about Sahel strategies the whole Sahel strategy. The table is just a summary of the different initiatives in the Sahel, in Africa, and in Western Africa. So you can see you have ECOWAS strategy, African Union, G5, Sahel Security College, the Joint Military Staff Committee of the Sahel region, the Fusion and Liaison Unit, and the Nouakchott process. Can you imagine? We are just at the African level. And we have to put also the UN, the EU, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, etc., etc. So my question is maybe G5, because we know that there is more and more an institutionalization of G5, because they decided to create a secretariat a few weeks ago, is to have a competition between maybe ECOWAS, but also a different process at the AU level in the middle term. So it's just a question, but maybe we will see in the middle term. The last 2 points is we need to invest and improve prevention mechanism. The lessons learned from Mali and from the Sahel is nothing is new. We knew everything about different factors of insecurity, but the challenge is to prevent, because you know that prevention is costless than conflict management. So we need to use the prevention mechanism. And to give you a good example, I mean, in the northern Mali, droughts are recurrent actually, and the population are more and more resilient in the northern Mali because they have the capacity to see in what moments they have to do something for preventing starvation. So it's a very good example at the local level. So we have the capacity at the local level. At the regional level, definitely, you have the early warning system. I mean, the ECOWAS, which is definitely good. But once again, the question is, how can we implement it locally? This analysis and information we manage to collect at the local level. Last issues is about find a balance between short-term and long-term objective. I told you the security development nexus is a very good example. I mean, we need to do both. I mean, we don't have to only have a short-term perspective, and maybe it's one of the main lessons learned from the implementation of the Sahel strategies in Mali. They only focus, actually, even if on the speech, on the text, they said we want to have a long-term perspective. We saw that actually they were only focused on the very short term because it's about visibility for these actors. And we need now to have to combine short-term and long-term strategy, and not only at the international level, but also at the national level. I mean, what is the strategy of Mali actually now? We don't see it. And Mali is supposed to be the main actors to create the strategy, to have a national policy, and then to bring the different strategy around this. But what we are seeing at the moment is just different strategy and the Mali at the middle, trying to choose what is the most interesting, like doing shopping, you see? So this is actually one of main lessons learned. We have to do it. I mean, national actors have to have this ownership about prevention and also conflict management. And it's going to be the last sentence. Don't forget that one of the main challenges for the international community is definitely that states is part of the solution, but it's also part of the problem. And now we definitely need to take this into account and to be aware of that, because Northern Mali is a very good example. Thank you.
You hear me? Yeah, I think so. Okay. I want to thank NUPI for making this seminar possible and for inviting such a large audience. We're very happy to be here. It's a regular stop on our annual Europe briefing tour, and we're very happy that we could do it again this year. I'm going to talk about the Central African Republic, which some of you may know is become sort of the definition of a failed state. And I think it's important for us to unpack a little bit, not so much how CA got there, but what it actually means to be an ungoverned state or a failed state, especially from a human development perspective. We often think of it as being defined by either the absence of state security forces or proliferation of non-state actors involved in security issues, but it's also about the presence of state. And in the Central African Republic, we haven't had that. So I'll just talk very briefly about governed spaces and then ungoverned spaces, and then specifically what that means for the Central African Republic. And in terms of governed space, what we're really talking about is a state presence, an administration, courts, a place where you can go and get an ID. This is the map of the Central African Republic. It's a country that's 3 times the size of France. so a very large space, which is essentially most developed in Bangui, the capital. Oops. Thank you, Andy. So in most of the Central African Republic, we don't have much of a state presence. What that means is we don't have a developed education system, we don't have access to healthcare, and the army also does not have a monopoly on violence. There's a lot of banditry, a lot of crime. The population essentially has no access to legal services, and so there's an absence of rule of law. We also have the vulnerability of local population to different armed groups which come into that vacuum. And we have a generalized state of impunity which leaves people quite vulnerable. And this is a long-term development in the Central African Republic, which really started at the end of colonialism, but where subsequent administrations, if you want to call them that, or governments, did not make really an effort to improve in any substantial way the infrastructure that had been left behind by the colonial power. And so today what you have is the Central African Republic, a population of 4.6 million people, ranking second to last on the Human Development Indicators Index. You have 77.5% of the population being defined as working poor, in other words, no real income to speak of, 80% subsistence agriculture, highly underdeveloped economy in other sectors, in spite of the presence of natural resources such as wood, diamonds, and gold and uranium. Education levels are also very, very low. We've, in the Central African Republic, had 5 coups since independence. The latest is Bozize, who was overthrown in March last year. It's also a state where the connection between the political elite in the capital, Bangui, and the population living anywhere else in the country it has completely ruptured. There's an absence of confidence on behalf of the population in the political elite, and the political elite tends to govern in Bangui. And even there, quite meagerly. If you were to visit Bangui, I think you would be not terribly impressed at the state of services, the state of infrastructure, and so forth. So there's no real social contract between governments. There's no history of that. There's no precedent for that in the Central African Republic. We've seen again and again the proliferation of armed groups, both on an ethnic basis, but also on a regional basis. That again is something that led to the coup last year, the alliance which became Seleka. Those rebel groups had actually been around in the Central African Republic for quite a few years, but eventually managed to coalesce and become an alliance that overthrew Bozize. But this is a reality that Central Africans have been living with for a long time. Banditry is also another one of the aspects of the absence of the state. These days, if you try to go north from Bangui to Chad, into Chad, you'll spend something like $150 just paying off people, various different bandits or armed groups at the roadblocks. So this is really a widespread reality. It also means that Central African Republic has become viewed by its neighbors as a weak state, as an absence of political power. And we've seen again and again, in particular Chad, play a destabilizing role and take advantage of the fact that there is no strong political power in Bangui. In fact, successive presidents, and really from one to the next, have used Chad as members of their own presidential guard because they don't trust their own army, because there tends to be a tendency to ethnicize the army. So if you inherit an army that was loyal to your predecessor, you want your own protection force, and Chad has traditionally played that role, and therefore also had a very large role to play in the overthrow then of these presidents when they no longer serve the purpose of Chad. And Chad is the most obvious of regional powers that has played a destabilizing role. Others are Congo-Brazzaville and to some extent rebel movements coming from the DRC, but also from Sudan. So that's another direct result of this gradual collapse of the state. It's important because the crisis that we have now, this very acute crisis, is just that. It's acute. It's not new. And when we, in fact, look at what happened last year, there was a regional peacekeeping force already in the country whose job it was to try and maintain some level of stability and try and also work with the government in the Central African Republic to reform the army, to undertake a DDR process, to try and improve on key governance issues. Even though Mikopax was there, Seleka was able to overthrow Bozize. We know that Mikopax has now become, was then turned into an African Union mission and is now a United Nations mission, MINUSCA, which essentially has many of the same tasks that Mikopax had are now on the plate of the new UN mission and of all the new actors who are essentially setting themselves up now in the Central African Republic. It's not just about peacekeeping. It's about state building. I should also add that the Central African Republic was in fact one of the three countries where the UN Peacebuilding Commission piloted its new approach to peacebuilding. So we had BINUCA there which is essentially a larger presence involved in state building, also during the Bozize years and up until the overthrow of Bozize by Seleka, but not much progress was made there. So it's a very, very tall order in terms of what the UN mission is expected to do. And I think one of the things that we feel is very important to emphasize is that there has to obviously be, if you want long-term change, ownership from the Central African Republic of this process. Because as much as we can try and disarm armies and put some discipline and training into an army, this has to be something where the political elite changes essentially how it sees politics and power in the Central African Republic and governs beyond the capital and governs beyond its own interests, whether they be financial or ethnic or other. And we have, in the Central African Republic now, there is a transition government led by Catherine Samba-Panza. There are supposed to be elections in 2015. Those are likely to be delayed. And Samba-Panza is in a difficult position. She inherited an essentially empty government with very few tools, including having her army disarmed. But she hasn't necessarily made a very positive impression, either on the Central African Republic itself or outside. And so she also is losing credibility in terms of her ability to deliver on some key initial steps, like reaching out to the different communities who have been displaced by the religious violence which really spiked last year. There hasn't been much progress on that. There hasn't been progress either on trying to figure out who should take part in a national dialogue. So in other words, not just a ceasefire or negotiations between the armed groups, but a dialogue with civil society and with key actors from various walks of life, including the armed groups. And what that really means is that the ownership, the leadership from Central Africa is weaker than it should be when you have international actors coming in and their mandate is to essentially take over many functions of the state. And we unfortunately don't have a very strong counterpart in Catherine Samba-Panza or her government, or for that matter, the National Assembly. And that is unfortunate, because it is, like many missions in the past, a very imbalanced situation. And so for the long term, that needs to be something that really needs to be worked on, this leadership and ownership of the peace process in the Central African Republic, because it is just the beginning of a longer term state building process that has been interrupted repeatedly. So I don't know, we don't have that much time. I kept it short deliberately. And I'll pass on to Andy and then take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for the opportunity. I'm speaking on Somalia within the context of ungoverned spaces. And as many of you know, it becomes a very tricky one, a very complex one if you discuss it from that perspective. You know, beyond the contestations around, certain actors that have emerged, particularly the UIC, and whether they constituted a governance at some level, or whether it was completely something that never fitted into the international conceptualization of what is acceptable as governance, and therefore, how do you define what is governed space and what is ungoverned space? What you then realize is that in certain contexts in Africa, you end up dealing with what is alternatively governed much more than an ungoverned space, because even places where you think no sense of governance exists, you have actors on the ground who are dictating the pace and the nature of things that happen on the ground. But within the context of ungoverned space in relation to Somalia, but particularly linking it to recent developments in the country, I'll try and organize my thoughts this way. First, try and do a quick history of how the struggle for trying to establish governance in Somalia has been, and what has been the basis, the key drivers of the evolution. And based on that, look at the structure that we now have as a new government, what is achieved so far, and the challenges going forward. And try and end in terms of recommendation by discussing what I call a determinant mix, what the mix is going to be in determining the future of Somalia, and the key actors, which I think if we get it wrong, we will necessarily get the whole, way forward for Somalia wrong as well. But my main point of departure is to argue that beyond the causes that we know, the form of anarchy, the form of confusion, the lack of peace, and the lack of structures in the country, the spillover of, say, radicalization into other parts of the region, into countries like Kenya, Uganda, and the rest, I would argue that conceptually, the biggest impact of ungoverned state in Somalia has been the fact that the quest for stability and peace in the country itself has ended up being a context for the restoration of governing authority over the country. And if you look at it that way, you then begin to understand that a lot of the things that happen in the country has always been about trying to restore governance in the country, and what that has mean, for how things have been approached in the country. And if you look at it for more than 2 decades that the country has had no leadership, this is really very clear. And at every point of that effort, you find that the differences in the approach between, say, the clans, between the international community, and between regional powers have been a key determinant in how it goes. Sometimes being positive, very many times it's become really very difficult. And if you look at the number of attempts that were made in the early 90s and across, from 91 up to the end of the transition, then you are talking about more than 14 attempts to try and restore governance into Somalia. And that included the 1993 Conference on the National Reconciliation in Addis Ababa, the 1997 Conference on Reconciliation also in Ethiopia, the 1997 Cairo Peace Conference, and then the Djibouti peace process, which many argue was the biggest turning point in the quest for the restoration of control in Somalia, basically because it was the basis for the inclusion of inclusivity as a requirement in the quest for peace in Somalia. And so that became the main basis for the establishment of the transitional national governance structures, the transitional national charter, which gave way to the transitional federal institutions, which also went on till we have the end of the transition. Now, at the end of the day, you realize that anytime you realize about 3 things. And you realize that the role of actors, anytime you have actor contestations, you have a lot of issues emerging, even in any form of governance that is put in Somalia, either at the clan level or whether it is domestic actors versus international actors. Second is always the role of the international community and regional powers, clearly there in the pursuit of that. And then again, any governance weakness that emerges, either as a result of the failure to consolidate security or infightings and corruption, becomes a basis for an evolution to another form of governance. And I'll be relating all of these to a lot of the things that are happening now and what we need to watch going forward in the country. So in the pursuit of the efforts to try and restore governance in a way that the international it's acceptable globally, we've succeeded in bringing about the end of the transition in 2012, and there's a new leadership in Somalia. My sense is that after a long time, this is the biggest opportunity we've had in Somalia. And since the government came, it's achieved quite a number of things. First, in the area of international representation, apart from the visibility internationally, this is one time in Somalia's recent history where you find that the country is mentioned as an existing state that is capable of entering into relations with its partners in the region and beyond. The government has also made quite substantial um, gains in terms of taking charge of security, particularly in Mogadishu and beyond. I mean, there are arguments about what level that has been and whether that is consolidated. But what you realize is that even in Mogadishu, about 80% was liberated. And within that, you have huge penetration of Al-Shabaab presence and the ability to easily hit and run, which makes it very difficult. But you also have renewed hope in Somalia's future by its diaspora and by its people. And within the context of the hearts and minds that we see in the country, that is a huge thing that we need to point to within the context of crafting governance for the country. And then again, the international goodwill, which was really the biggest basis for the end of the transition. And virtually the biggest determinant going forward and what becomes of the existing government. But despite this, what you realize is that the government has huge challenges on the ground. One, in terms of consolidating security. In Mogadishu, as I indicated, 80% is deemed to have been, liberated on paper. But the extent to which Al-Shabaab presence is all over is something that you cannot discount. So consolidating security in the liberated areas is one, but even within that, we see a pattern of the liberation of areas where it is more about big towns and cities. What about places that that haven't got cities? What do you do? And so does it mean that going for the pursuit of the Al-Shabaab, for instance, will have to move from the cities to the jungles where they some of the places where they are? But there's also a challenge in the implementation of federalism. And I have been arguing that if we are not careful, our inability to make sure that things are done right at the federalism level will end up devolving the level of some form of anarchy that we've seen at the national level back to the base and create hotspots of instability. If you look at how the Jubaland process led, what it led to, if you look at the sort of confusion that surrounded the creation of the Southwest state, and now even the creation of the state with Galmudud and all of that, it gives you a sense that it's the biggest solution for the country, but it is one that has the biggest problem, capable of bringing about a lot of issues. Then you have the whole issues about infighting. Already we've seen that Abdi Sheridan as the prime minister has given way to Abdiweli Sheikh, who is doing really well. But if you look at the structure of governance in the country, you realize that the president is mandated to nominate a prime minister. But the prime minister is the head of the ministers. So virtually he becomes the head of government. So anytime you have a very active prime minister, he overshadows the president. And whenever the president ends up wanting to be visible, you end up with a clash of roles. And that will breed infightings. And in the past, infighting has been a huge problem for the restoration of governance in Somalia. And it is something that we really need to watch. Abdi Sheridan left. We know Abdiweli Sheikh is in place. Already there are signs of rifts at that level. And going forward is something that will determine, to some extent, the stability of the government in Somalia. And you have issues of corruption, but also what I call the mechanics of ungoverned space. It's been about 2 decades without governance as we know it. And apart from the difficulties in changing the way things run, there was certainly an inbuilt resistance to the way things have been running to change. And that alone is one big trouble that the country is faced with. And then the biggest challenge is the Al-Shabaab attacks. At the level of massive infiltration in government, but also the ability to hit and run and melt into the population. And that makes it really difficult. Before Westgate, I spoke to one influential Somali actor, an MP, who was part of the drafting of the constitution. And what he said was this, that within the context of trying to restore governance in Somalia, this is what he said, and I quote, that a transition has begun in Somalia. The previous transition was one from anarchy. Somalia is now in a transition to peace and stabilization, and its inherent challenges ought to be acknowledged. And I think that he really summarizes a great deal of the things where Somalia is now. And one thing that I always note is that Somalia has made huge progress now. If it doesn't work now, it may be difficult getting it to work again. And so we need to put in all our energy at this level. And purely from the perspective of the ungoverned space, I think that we have what I call the determinant mix, made up of three actors. One is the government at one level. Then you have the international community. Then you have the Al-Shabaab. So it's kind of a triangular relationship where you have the government at the top, you have the international community, and Al-Shabaab at the base. The relationship between the government and Al-Shabaab, in my view, are inversely related. Strong government will imply less and less of Al-Shabaab's capacity. More of Al-Shabaab capacity will imply less and less of respect and acceptance of the government, but also the relevance of the government, less and less of that. But the strength of the government is also hinged on the role that the international community is playing in terms of humanitarian activity, in terms of support, in terms of training actors within the army and all of that. So the triangular relationship and how these play out in our dealing in Somalia is really crucial going forward. If we get a very bad mix of these, we will certainly not get it right. And I think one thing we need to watch is the temptation that many actors feel that the government is weak, and so you have to use less of the government. I think the reverse should be the case, because my perspective is that the Somali government is almost like a weak muscle now. The only way to strengthen the weak muscle is to make use of that muscle, because apart from the fact that there's a conflict going on, it is also about the conflict for the hearts, the context for the hearts and minds of people. The less visible the government is, the more relevant the actors like the Al-Shabaab become. And so the more we are able to sustain the government and use the government and make the government more visible beyond Mogadishu and everywhere, the less and less relevance many will see in the Al-Shabaab. And so that mix will work out going forward. If we don't work out that mix, we may end up in chaos again. And that will be very difficult, because the hope that the international community has, the efforts they put in, the goodwill of the Somali diaspora, I mean, the will of the leadership at the moment, if all of these fail, there will be a rollback and relapse in terms of commitment to making it work again. And that is going to be really difficult. That would then be when we may see the actual practicality of our ungoverned space in the country. At the moment, I think that we've made some strides, and we just need to sustain it at one level, but also make sure it's consolidated and moved forward. I'll end there so that we can have a chat around that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for your very insightful briefings. I'll open the floor to you now for questions and comments, and I'll ask you to identify yourself before you ask questions and tell me who you are addressing. Again, Lee will bring around a microphone, 2 microphones. So, anybody want to go first? Nobody? Yeah. Yes, it's coming behind you.
Hello, my name is Thomas Rowan. I'm working at Björknes University College, teaching peace and conflict studies, and I write a PhD on the Central African Republic in conflict and identity. I'm just wondering, I think it's interesting what you said about the lack of institution building in the Central African Republic, because you have other conflicts such as, say Angola, where there's been a number of coups, but after the coup, you see the coup makers reform institutions trying to prove that they can govern the country, whereas in the Central African Republic, that hasn't happened. So I'm just wondering, what do you think the key reasons for that are, that you don't see this institution building in CAR?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, and a difficult one to answer as well. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think if you, I mean, you know about the CAR. If you look at the history of governance there, or of governments, I should say there. I mean, we have that era where, you know, David Dacko, Bokassa, very heavily supported by the French, and I think years where really challenging the government for the absence of performance was not a dynamic at all. And that's a rupture, I think, that you see in other Central African countries as well, also the DRC, for example. Bokassa is fondly remembered, as you may know, if you've been to Bangui, for having built something. He's built some roads and buildings, and it's surprising how much nostalgia there is for him for that little that he did do. I think it's a telling about low expectations. The people who came after him, in many ways, I think some didn't have time. André Koulibaly was democratically elected, but then overthrown as well. And I think Bokassa and David Dacko, to some extent as well, really instilled this sense of government being a predatory factor. I mean, Bokassa crowned himself as emperor. I think that says it all in many ways. He felt he was the Central African Republic, and the Central African Republic was his. And that tradition just hasn't really been changed. And we know that successive presidents have come in, Patassé, Bozizé, have created their own wings of the army that are loyal to them, have used their own people from their own ethnic areas, from their own areas and their own ethnic groups, essentially to both run the army, run the institutions, run the economy, insofar as one can say that they were run. And there just isn't that tradition. I mean, I don't want to use the word tradition. There isn't that practice. There isn't that sense of accountability. I think we have doubts as well about the few elections that have taken place. Koulibaly, Bozizé had 2 elections. To what extent those were, and even Patassé was elected, to what extent those were free and fair. We did have Minurka there to oversee the election of Patassé, but Patassé didn't stay long enough really to have delivered, and also had particular things that he had on his agenda. And so in some ways, I mean, there is this sense that, you know, one part of the country was favored by one president. When another takes over, it's time to favor that part of the country, as opposed to governing for the entire country. And I don't think we're, unfortunately, at the end of that. When you look at the way in which, you know, the government that we have now is behaving, and some of the tendencies we think, Samba Panza also favoring people from where she comes from. And I mean, some of that is a little bit, you know, maybe those are people with whom she feels comfortable and has worked before. So we try not to be too critical, but there is certainly that's just a historical pattern, and I think that's key to breaking. Is key to long-term state building, is breaking that and having a government that is not working for itself, or a president that is not working for himself or herself, and moving beyond that. And until you do that, this will be, you know, endless.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah. Ingrid? She will come with a microphone.
Yeah, my name is Gry Synevåg from the Department of International Environment and Development Studies at Ås. I would like to ask a question about northern Mali, also the conflict in Mali, because it's very interesting to listen to you, easy to follow. I'm not an expert on security, but maybe more on the development side. And you mentioned that one of the big challenges, also the conflict in Mali is a multidimensional crisis, that's clear. But one of the main drivers is poverty and lack of development and marginalization of the northern parts of Mali. And you said one of the challenges is to combine security and development. And I would like to know a little bit more about the thinking around this, because you have different actors in northern Mali, both on the security side and on the development side, still working. For example, the civil society is still there, local civil society, international actors, and you have the police, you have the armed forces, the national, and you have, of course, the UN forces. And I would like to know a little bit more of the thinking of mechanisms that could be put in place to combine development and security, both in the long term, no, in the short term and the long term. Because this is really a huge challenge, and civil-military collaboration is not always the answer to this. So.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It is definitely the difficult question for everybody on the ground. I mean, trying to combine the humanitarian aspects, because you need to have enough security for humanitarian, to have humanitarian assistance. I think in the very short term, of course, you need to have militaries trying to secure, but at the same time, if you have a look at MINUSMA, for instance, it's very difficult. I mean, except in the city of Gao, the city of Tombouctou, and we don't talk about Kidal, there is no security in the other region. So how can you do? When we did these reports, we thought that maybe one of the solutions could be to use local actors, because they live there, they know the people around them. But you know, there is very, there is consequences of the system, of the clientelist system in Northern Mali, that even if you use actually local actors, they try, for instance, to distribute the foods. They just use their own groups to give food. I mean, there is no collective conception of the public goods. This is one of the main challenge. I mean, there is also instrumentalization of international aids. Sorry. Because if you have a look again, I mean, everybody wants to be a consultant for the international community now, because, of course, I told you that we need to do assessment. So everybody at the moment is doing an assessment of where we failed, what was the real success. But to have the assessment, you need to talk with people from the ground, and people from the ground want to be paid. So we are created another informal economy by paying these people just to give them the opportunity to talk about what they are living every day. You see, so it's very difficult at the moment, because it's a very complex system. I mean, at every step you have to take care, because there always this temptation to use the international implication in Northern Mali to have some individual or collective gain, but not in a way to create public goods, but in the very narrow perspective. So, I mean, we try to find some solution. One of the solutions could be to identify with which local organization you can work. You can work, actually. So to have a collective list, I mean, that, for instance, the different donors have the capacity to identify which actor we can trust, actually, to be sure that if we give money, if we give supports, they're going to do it, and they're going to do it, I mean, properly. This is the main challenge. The other one is also to, as you said, I mean, to have increasing implication of civil society, and more from the women, actually. because, as you know, they are most of the time they have the main victims, and they try to protect their children. They try to play a better role. So more and more you see this local initiative around women. I mean, trying to have a better involvement of women at the local level. And actually it's doing quite well. But what can I say again? I mean, definitely the main challenge is about youth employment. I mean, we don't have now the solution. What can we suggest? When you have the capacity to have a lot of money just by taking up arms, and when you just do nothing during the day, it's a little bit a cliche, but actually this is the reality of day. I mean, of every day. So what we suggested, because actually at the ISS we had some junior fellow, and 2 of them were from Gao, and they are very smart. So what we suggested maybe to have a program for young Malian students, and trying to involve them in, you know, some UN agency, some different, maybe to be consultant for the EU, to work closely with other research centers, you see, but try to think that Northern Mali is not only about the future of I mean, it's not only rebel. We are not talking about only rebellion. There is also very smart people. So how can you use these people to work with them? And this is also one of the solutions we try to identify. But actually, the real problem is about money. I mean, there is there is a lot of money in Mali. Money is not it's not about money. It's about organization. We need to reorganize. Stephanie was talking about the social contract in Central Africa. It's exactly the same in Northern Mali. How can we create? I mean, and we are not sure that at the beginning we had this social contract. So how can what can be the basis at the political level? How can we try to give this will from people to live together, to share life together? And I think this is now a national issue. It's not about Western countries. It's about a local, national project.
Any other questions? Yes.
Tack. Pia Isaksäter, a political scientist. When I was steering committee member in Sherbrigg in the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, we once got a status briefing on Somalia at our meeting at UNHQ in New York. Faced with the challenges of Somalia, I then felt very helpless. I did not know what to do as a political scientist or as a military advisor. And the next time I dealt with Somalia was when I represented Norway at the Fourth Generation Conference for the EU naval operation Atalanta in Brussels in March 2009, and then sending a Norwegian frigate to protect our ships against Somalian pirates. How can Norway, bilaterally and as a member of the UN, help the Somali state building in the best way? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And you know, I think it's a very big question. But first, let me start from the angle of, say, the deployment of the flotilla. And sometimes that is part of the problem, that there's the will to do something, but at the end of the day, you get a sense that what matters to Somalia sometimes doesn't matter to everyone until it matters to others, and then it's suddenly projected as something that is Somalia matters. Again, if you look at it more closely, the whole idea of fighting terror in Somalia, we could have fought terror in Somalia purely from the angle of wanting peace for Somalia. But you have a whole store of arguments that looks at it purely from the fact that there's a possibility of a backlash coming from the returning Al-Shabaab to the West. Now, sometimes if you go with that motivation, certainly the end goal is the same, but you end up capacitating and losing the battle for the hearts and minds of people who think that you are there not because of us, you are here because of your interests and all of that. So I think that, first of all, we need to sometimes look at how the communication goes about our formulation of responses to Somalia's problems. Is it all about Somalia or is about other interests? Because that is really important. Number two, in terms of helping build the state, I feel that at the moment, support for the Somali government and its 6 priority areas is about the most fantastic thing to do, option, in terms of, because there's a lot that every country can do on the ground. But you may not win the collective battle if at the end of the day you are seen as acting and not really the government of Somalia. Because the future of Somalia depends on the ability of the people of Somalia, through their leaders, to take charge of the formulation of its future and the implementation of the activities that fits into that vision. So whatever we do, if we do not support what vision the people have crafted for themselves through their leaders and try and prop it up that way, it will become counterproductive at the end of the day. Because if you build hospitals and you market Turkey, market Norway and all of that, beyond that, if you pierce that veil of some form of development, you'll be asking, what did the government do? But if the government is supported and the government does it, you will not only win the battle of development in Somalia, you will actually also have the basis to diffuse those, who will be recruiting people against the state. And I think that is the only consistent way to build sustainable governance in Somalia, as where we are at the moment. Let me leave it there because I know it's a long discussion. Thank you.
Then I'll give the floor to you. Just put your hand up and you will get a mic.
Okay, it's a follow-up to Mr. Andrew on Somalia. I'm Per Schøning is my name. I'm working for Statistics Norway, and we are involved in Somalia through the NRC, together with UNFPA, to do the population census. During that time, me spending in Somalia or in Kenya, I've learned that we talk about the 3 zones, we talk about the pre-war regions, and we are very careful to talk about Somalia as such, to be able to communicate with Puntland, Hargeisa, and Mogadishu. Now, my question to you, because it's ungoverned zones, that is your topic, how do you see the way forward for Somaliland, the Hargeisa regime, in this context?
Thank you very much. I've followed the push by the Somaliland regime for recognition, and the biggest argument they make is that there's instability in Somalia. It was a marriage they went into which is not working, so it is natural to ask for divorce within that context. And in that sense, the biggest sympathy they've had was so much about the fact that there was difficulty in stabilizing Somalia. At the moment, I think we are at a crossroad. We've made some progress. And so that gives an indication that all things being equal, if we sustain the level of support that the international community has put in, with the support of the Somali diaspora and all of that, we are likely to see not complete peace, but some level of stabilization as a transition to real peace. No one knows when. But the unintended consequence of that is that selling the idea of separation for Somaliland diminishes right there, because you have Somalia that is making gains. So what is your basis for arguing you want to be independent? And so that is at one level. Number two is some level of disconnect between the political leadership in Hargeisa and and the collective will of the people. It's difficult knowing whether they are pushing the interests of the whole Somalilanders, or it is just the interest of certain individuals at the political level. Because during the transition, there were certain traditional leaders who wanted to participate. And the Hargeisa leadership said it was treason and something like that. That gives you a sense of the differences and at what level that quest for independence does exist. Is it everyone, or is just some group of people? So going forward, the viability of that option of independence for Somaliland is tied to the stability of Somalia. If it works this time, I think they will not have any goods to sell. But if the efforts for stabilization that fail now, I think they will actually end up having the biggest sympathy they've ever had, and that can ripple into some recognition across the world. It's a very complex dynamic now playing out, yeah.
My name is Ingse Skattum. I'm a professor emeritus of the University of Oslo, responsible for African area studies south of the Sahara, and a specialist of Francophone Africa. I have two questions concerning Francophone Africa. One to the Central African Republic. You didn't mention the religious aspect. I was wondering how it plays in with the other aspects, which I found very convincing, your talk. Thank you. And mostly for Mali, where I have been working for many, many years, not living there, but going regularly. And my impression is that people's attitude are an important factor, because what I see on the net and hear from my friends and colleagues is that people are very negative to the Tuaregs, in part, like you said, because for every rebellion they've had advantages that feel that other populations in the north feel unfair. I mean, the Songhai and the Fulani, they are subject to the same climatic conditions and other shortcomings. And also the attitudes towards MINUSMA seem to me to be fairly negative. They have pride in their own cultural history and don't like foreign forces, and they also point to the fact that in many countries these forces have been responsible for rapes and violence, and so they don't trust them. My impression, I'd like you to confirm, is that they preferred the Chadians and the French to the MINUSMA forces, but I haven't been there for some time, so I would like your comment on that. Thank you.
Stephanie, do you want to go first? Yep.
For the question, and for the opportunity to speak about that, because it's obviously something that is central in some ways to what's happening at the moment. I think you surely know that this was not an issue in the Central African Republic at all before. And if there are some things that speak in favor of a national identity, it's also the fact that there's one language, Sango, which is spoken, that these communities on a religious level, very integrated and really no issues. The reason for this division along religious lines is because Seleka comes from, oh, the map is no longer there, but from the northwestern part, close to Sudan. And many of the leaders, amongst others, Jotodia, Nuruddin Adam, are themselves Muslim. And we know that in the almost 1 year that Seleka ruled the country, there were a lot of atrocities, a lot of reprisals against the population, a lot of looting. So a lot of strong, heavy loss borne by the civilian population and perpetrated by a majority Muslim group. I don't think one can even say necessarily targeting specifically Christians, although people in Central African Republic may disagree with that. And I think what we saw at the end of last year with the anti-Balaka, it's taken place along religious lines because of this predominance and because of, I think, also Seleka's the key leaders, but it's also its profile in general being predominantly Muslim. But there's also another dynamic to it, which is that it's some anti-Balaka are to some extent also pro-Bozize, so there's the normal opposition to a Seleka, and so on and so forth. And then in a context where, frustration levels are tremendously high. Your ability there's no recourse. Who do you go to when someone has burnt down your house? There's no one to go to. So at some point, I think there's also a level where there's a tipping point, and you take matters into your own hands. And unfortunately, not that it's justifiable, it's just a context. And unfortunately, that's taken place along religious lines. And we know that hundreds of thousands of Muslims have left the country and are in neighboring countries now. And it's questionable whether they will come back. And I think moving forward, obviously, what we need is both a reconciliation process. And I think whereas we don't really have strong leadership in the political elite, we do have fairly strong leadership in these religious communities, which is important, and who have spoken very moderately and with reconciliatory tones about what needs to happen between the communities. And so that's important. Those could be really key figures, I think, in moving that way. But you also need the return of those populations if you want to restore the demographic that you once had, which is integral to Central African Republic. But in a moment where nobody can guarantee your security, and that is now. I think whichever religion you are, you're not going to choose to go back to a place where you were in danger, where you may have lost family members and property and so on and so forth. I don't think at the moment, there's obviously this ongoing struggle between Anti-Balaka and Seleka. The religious thing hasn't played a huge role in terms of the negotiations. There are no demands for changes in the constitution or for particular arrangements to be made for religious communities. So on the negotiation level, on the political level, it's about power and not really about the religion. But it's a new cleavage, and it's something that has to be addressed very, very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I totally agree with you. As you know, Mali is, even in Tuareg, it's a very complex society. And you see the different, groups actually taking part in the peace process as the good image of this. This is the reality, because they don't have the capacity to stay together, because it's about how can you distribute, how you can have access to the wealth of the northern Mali, and notably the traffic. And if you just look back to how this group were created, you can understand everything about the future of the negotiation. In Mali. So the first idea is, we don't have to maybe have to see the Tuareg as a homogeneous group. So definitely, it's about actually power sharing in northern Mali. That's all. That's the only issue. About MINUSMA, again, we should not see Mali as only a country, and the people don't care about what is going on in the other countries of Africa. And I remember the first reaction when they knew that they should have a UN mission. It was, we don't want it, actually, because we have in mind the MONUSCO in DRC, and we don't want to have a mission during maybe more than 10 years in the northern Mali, and with no capacity, and staying there and paying these people, with some of them actually rape or women. So we don't want it, because we don't see what they want to do. There is no peace to keep. We don't need it. And state building, it's not about state building. We don't have a state to build. We are independent, and we don't care about MINUSMA. And for the French people, they call MINUSMA amusement, because they are here only to have fun, and mainly in Bamako. So the first reaction was very negative about MINUSMA. concerning the French, it depends on which region and which city, because you know the case of Kidal. I mean, it's a very specific one, but it's a very good, opportunity to see how French. I mean, it's very difficult because the situation is evolving since the French intervention in northern Mali, and I think the situation now is more. I mean, it's more difficult for France to stay in Bamako, in northern Mali, and that's why they decided to stay in Gao. I mean, and maybe go further in the north. About the Chadian, I mean, it's the same. I mean, they are not coming from Western Africa, so it's easy because there is no, historic about how some kind of relation. But I don't think, I mean, my opinion is in northern Mali, they want nobody. French, MINUSMA, Chadian, they don't want it. I mean, they just want to continue to do business and to have access to the network, and that's all. That's the only way. That's why they are testing every day the capacity of MINUSMA, maybe to fight and to the resilience against the different attacks. And that's why the first victim were the Chadian, actually, because they knew that they could be the best army being in northern Mali. So, I mean, it's also very interesting. We were talking about that yesterday, and you need to take into account that every time you decided to intervene in a conflict, you change the balance of strength. You change the way people have created this system, actually, what we call the conflict system. You change. I mean, even if your objective is to bring peace or to be a spoiler, every time you have people within the system, they are changing the balance of strengths, the balance of forces. And MINUSMA actually changes it in a way. France changes it in a way. And so it's very difficult because you have at the same time all these groups which are very flexible, which are a lot of mobility. And you have always, now we have the UN mission, but they are supposed to have the ontology in the way they are doing war. So it's very difficult because how can you react? I mean, that's also another issue. So again, the situation in northern Mali is definitely complex, and you have to take care of in what way you can change the local balance of strength. Yeah.
We have time for one more quick question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations, all three of you. I'm Toril Satre. I'm from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I had a question just to follow up on the northern Mali situation. We are currently present both in Gao and in Timbuktu. And my question was a bit also about the perception. When you talk about perception, do you get any impression that people are able to distinguish between a humanitarian intervention and a more development intervention? Because for us, especially in the context, if we're talking about pairing development and a security, it becomes very difficult for us to operate. So just your impressions.
Thank you for your question. Actually, this is a very interesting question. In northern Mali, it's very difficult to distinguish humanitarian and development because actually development is supposed to be a long term. You need to create something. But I mean, when we did these assessments, we are talking. We have to know. I mean, what do you need to create in terms of state capacity? But are we sure that this capacity existed before, for instance, the attack in 2012? So that's why there is a confusion between humanitarian and development, I mean, from a local perspective. Because you need, for instance, to give a very basic example, the school has been destroyed. But are you sure that the school was functioning before the attack? Or is it just about we need a school, but actually we need to create everything? So if the school was functioning, you are in humanitarian assistance. But actually, if they didn't have any school in this part, I mean, no table, nothing to work in. You are in the humanitarian assistance. So it's very difficult because you have to have this assessment of what was there before the crisis. And I see this confusion. I saw this confusion actually in the different actors from the humanitarian and development area, because it's very difficult to have access to the information. And once again, it's a big temptation to say we need some help, but actually, what was the situation before the crisis? So, yeah. But maybe to follow up the first question, I think one of the key issues is maybe to invest in human capacity, because school, I mean, everything you can build in a very with stone is a way, but what you can have in the long term is human capacity. If you have the capacity to train people, for instance, how you can be a mayor in northern Mali. I mean, if you don't have the capacity to how do you mean, to manage your budget, for instance, because it was the case. I mean, some mayor doesn't know how to count. So you are talking about corruption, but actually people don't know how to count. So how can they do their work day to day if they don't have this capacity? They don't know how to manage the city. So you see, it's very important. I mean, one lessons learned is invest human capacity. Try to train people. Try to see, and you will be. I mean, always. I mean, you will have always this blur line between humanitarian and development, definitely. Mostly in the area where you are in an insecure situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we'll have to wrap up. So I'll just ask you all to join me in thanking Andrews, Amandine and Stephanie to take time in your very busy schedule to come and give us very interesting briefings and answer our questions. Thank you very much. And there are some publications from ISS on the table there, so please have a look. Thank you.